military operation since the Yom Kippur War in 1973. 55,000 soldiers called up to remove 8,100 settlers from Gaza. And I want to tell you, I've been in a few wars, and none of them were as tragic, as traumatic as this evacuation, this engagement was for me. To go into people's houses and to carry them off physically, screaming and crying. At one point, we had to break into a synagogue and carry off worshipers physically onto buses. The disengagement, as it was called, capital D, was a tremendous gamble for Sharon and for Israel. We all knew that the Palestinian organizations, Hamas in particular, would declare a victory. And yet we hoped that the Palestinian people would seize this historic opportunity, that this would be the creation of the first de facto independent Palestinian polity. The gamble failed. Rather than concentrating on development, the Palestinians proceeded to fire some 1,000 rockets and mortar shells into Israel. Now, Israel always faces this cruel dilemma. It's going to come up again and again to this very morning. If you fight Hamas, and Hamas will gain prestige if you fight Hamas among the Palestinians. But if you don't fight Hamas, and Hamas fires rockets at you, then Hamas gains prestige among the Palestinians. It's an absolute no-win situation for Israel. And Hamas gained, both from the defeat in the Intifada and for the fact of its victory in the disengagement. And that success gained it immense prestige, and it also gained it the attention of Iran, which now extended massive economic and military aid to the organization. Israel responded with a naval and air blockade which did not prevent Hamas from shooting rockets, but it only strengthened Hamas's casus belli against Israel. Israel, meanwhile, held its fire. Sharon understood that the last thing Israelis wanted after 30 years of occupation was to go back into Gaza. And indeed, he had created a new party called Kadima, dedicated to unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank as well. It was a course he was about to embark upon when he fell into a coma in January of 2006 and was replaced by Ehud Olmert. Elections, meanwhile, were held in the Palestinian territories. Many Israelis, myself included, remember with horror the election ad of a Hamas candidate named Mariam Farahat, also known as Nidal. In the commercial, she invites viewers to come into her home. She shows them a picture that's sort of encrusted in gold of a young man wearing a Hamas military outfit. She says, "This is my eldest son who martyred himself by blowing himself on a Jewish bus and killed eight Jews. It was the happiest day of my life that my son blew himself up and was able to be reunited with Allah." Then she takes you into another room and shows you another picture of another Hamas soldier and says, "This is my second son who blew himself up attacking Jewish soldiers. It was the happiest day of my life, the day he blew up." And she says, "Now I want you to meet my third son." And she brings in this 17-year-old kid dressed in a military outfit, wearing the Hamas banner across his forehead with an M16. She says, "He's about to go out to martyr himself out now, and this is the happiest day of my life." And she starts kissing him and kissing him. He went out and blew himself up at the Erez crossing. It was an advertisement for Hamas. Nidal is now in parliament as a representative of Hamas. She won an overwhelming victory. Hamas's victory spurred another escalation of rocket attacks, and then Egypt intervened. Egypt intervened and mediated a truce, a tahdiyah in Arabic, but Hamas government exploited that truce to dig a 400-meter tunnel under the border, and on June 25th, 2006, they attacked an Israeli position, killing 2 soldiers and kidnapping a third 19-year-old Corporal Gilad Shalit. The IDF's attempts to respond to this attack, to blow up the many tunnels that Hamas had dug under the Philadelphia route, ended with Israeli soldiers scouring the sand on all fours, looking for the body parts of their comrades. The Europeans had volunteered to supervise the border crossings over between Gaza and Israel, but the monitors were threatened by Hamas, and they fled. Thousands of tons of munitions, rifles, grenades, rockets passed into Gaza from Egypt. It was this point that another bizarre thing happened. Hezbollah attacked Israel. Now, it is not my intention tonight to go into the long and tormented relationship between Israel and Lebanon, or even my role in it. I was in one of those first jeeps to go into Beirut in 1982. I spent all told about a year in Lebanon. You want to go see 2 Israeli films, Waltz with Bashir and Beaufort, both of them recommended for Oscars. That basically sums up my Lebanon experience. They'll serve as bookmarks to my Lebanon episode. Suffice it to say that Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed Shiite militia, had also been strengthened by a unilateral Israeli withdrawal in May of 2000, and it subsequently armed itself with about 12,000 rockets of various ranges. Now, Hezbollah is an ally of Hamas, but it's also a competitor of Hamas. And since Hamas was victorious over Israel, Hezbollah could scarcely sit quietly and not respond. And so on July 12th of 2006, Hezbollah ambushed an Israeli border patrol, killing 10, taking 2 of the bodies and holding them for ransom. And Israel responded with what we now call the Second Lebanon War. And though the IDF killed as much as a fourth of all of Hezbollah's forces and destroyed much of its infrastructure in southern Lebanon and in Beirut, Hezbollah nevertheless continued to rocket Israeli cities, and it too claimed a great victory. Short of realizing its goals of destroying Hezbollah, of securing the release of its captive soldiers, Israel was compelled to accept a UN ceasefire that enabled Hezbollah to rearm. Now, many Israelis linked the Gaza disengagement to the failed Second Lebanon War. I remember being up on the border the last day of the war. I hadn't slept, I don't know, in how many days, weeks. And who would I run into but my close colleague from the Shalem Center, Natan Sharansky, who was up there with a Knesset committee. He was still in Knesset. And I was so glad to see him. And I said, Natan, it's so good to see you. And he looked at me with this something-eating grin and says to me, do you still think disengaging for Gaza was a good idea? Quote, unquote. Yes. I still think it was a good idea. The missile's mistake was not in disengaging from Gaza, but it was not in responding immediately and massively to the Qassam rocket attacks, which immediately broadcast a message of Israeli weakness throughout the entire Middle East. And that message was amplified over the course of the next 2 years. In a bloody coup in June of 2007, Hamas overthrew the al-Fatah-led government in Gaza, killing some 350 Fatah activists. Some of them were chucked off the top of multi-story buildings. It banished a great many more. They were given asylum in Israel. Israel reacted by imposing a partial blockade of the border crossings, but the policy proved problematic. Though the United States and the European Union all recognized Hamas as a terrorist organization and generally supported the blockade, Israel was internationally censured for cutting off vital supplies. Hamas, in a classic example, would shell the gas stations along the Gaza Strip, along the gas depots. And then if the gas went through, Hamas was using the gas as a propellant in the Qassam rockets that were striking Israel. And yet when Israel turned around and cut off gasoline supplies to Israel, it was internationally condemned for mounting a collective punishment against Palestinian civilians. The blockade once again furnished Hamas with a pretext for intensifying rocket and mortar attacks. Some 7,200 rockets and mortars fell in Israel between 2005 and 2008. Citizens of southern Israel felt betrayed by their state. They felt abandoned. Public pressure on the military grew, but the government still hesitated. What were they waiting for? Well, first there was the question of Lebanon. Lebanon had exposed some severe deficiencies in the IDF's equipment, its training, its command. The defense minister, chief of staff, had been forced to resign. Israelis had lost much of their faith in their military, and these deficiencies had yet to be addressed. Israeli leaders feared that world opinion would again condemn any Israeli action and impose a ceasefire before Israel had achieved its goals. And there was an absence of a strong government in Israel. Israel Prime Minister Ehud Olmert was facing multiple corruption charges. But the deepest of all was the fear of Hamas, fear that of the truly excruciating price that Hamas could exact with its booby traps, with its anti-tank missiles, with its ambushes, with its suicide bombers, the price that it could exact from the Israeli military. And Israel is super sensitive to military losses. And there was a fear that once Israel attacked in Gaza, that Hezbollah would once again join the fray. And so Israel held its fire and instead agreed to another Egyptian broker